Welcome, everybody. Today, we are really fortunate to be joined by a financial expert, a college funding financial expert named Brad Baldrige, who is going to help us fill in some gaps that I know I have in my legal knowledge. And I know Linda and I have talked about this on multiple occasions. How in the heck do you deal with college financial planning in the midst of a divorce or after you're already separated? Those are really important questions, I know, for the kids because they're worried about it for sure. And so are the parents. And so Brad is going to help us learn about that and come up with some great advice for parents of all different types on how to deal with the college planning. So, Brad, welcome. And could you introduce yourself for us and tell us who you are?
Sure. My name is Brad Baldrige. I work with a lot of families in what I call late stage college planning. In other words, you've got a high school kid and you're trying to figure it all out. And I also have a podcast and all kinds of great resources on my website. So this is something I've been working on for years, and it's something that I think that especially as we get into some of these areas like divorce, where there's a lot that can be done, but people just don't know about it, so they don't do them. And I think it's important that, especially where parents are getting along, that, nobody likes separation and that kind of stuff, but you need to, if you can cooperate, it can make a huge difference in the overall process.
Yeah, definitely. And the website that he's referring to is tamingthehighcostofcollege.com. And we will have links to his website and also to his podcast in the show notes. So y'all can find that there and go learn even more about what Brad has to teach. So, Linda, this is something that I know you've heard a lot about over the years, this issue of college planning and just parents fighting about it and kids being stuck in the middle.
Yes, the children are frequently quite concerned, and it can start earlier in high school than you might imagine. Most of them, I think, in the junior year are already starting to fill out college apps and so forth. We used to wait until senior year at least, or sometimes the second semester of senior year to do all that, but it's not happening that late for most people these days, and the children are quite concerned, and it affects their relationship with each of the parents also, depending on what that parent's telling them. So I think, like the rest of our podcasts and our academy, it's around what Brad just said. It's letting people know some wonderful options and ways to communicate about this.
And so, Brad, let's pretend for the moment that we have an idyllic separation situation where the parents can't get along, but enough to be married, but they're still able to put their child's best interest first and to communicate with each other about things like college financial planning. How would you start to talk with parents who are coming to you saying, "Hey, we're getting separated. We have a child who's going to be going to college in X number of years. Uh, what should we be doing?" And I'm sure that is a loaded and incomprehensible question, but what would you think?
Right. So I think a good way to get your head around college planning is there's a lot of college planning that everybody has to do. Right. So there's the stuff that the parents kind of do by themselves, which is, should we be saving and investing for college? How much are we willing to spend on college? Will we get need based aid and merit aid? And, again, a lot of times the financial side of college is very much in the parents' to do list. And then the students, of course, hopefully figure out what they want to be when they grow up. And they're going to write the essays, hopefully, and do the college applications and that kind of stuff. And then there's the stuff that you do together, which is maybe test planning, scholarship planning, choosing a school visits, and that type of thing. And so all of that stuff happens for everybody. But then on top of that, if you're divorced and separated, you've got an extra layer of things that need to be worked out, like, well, who's actually going to be on the financial aid forms? When we go and do visits, are we going to work together and go as a family, or we, as just mom or just dad going to go on visits? Who's going to pay for college, and how is that going to fit into that? Was that part of the agreement when we were, if assuming the divorce is final and everything, was that discussed when we were working on this stuff, or Was it just ignored? Where we stand and all that. So there's that extra stuff. And there's a lot of other things as well, right? If you're a business owner, there's additional complexity. If you have a student athlete, there's additional complexity. If you've got a rock star student that might go to the highly elite schools, there's some additional complexity. So there's other things too, and you might have that and divorce. So when you talk about in the biggest picture of college planning, like I said, there's a core everybody does, but then there's these extra things that come along, and divorce and or separation is one of the big ones.
So, of the things that you've mentioned already, talking of which one do you think is most helpful to get parents sort of into this conversation to help them get grounded in terms of the terms and things that they're going to need to know as we get into more complicated parts?
Right. Yeah. So I think one of the big areas is, like I said, the finances. So one big piece of that puzzle is the financial aid forms and the FAFSA. I think that's one of the things that most families are, at least vaguely aware of, and they start thinking about, well, who's going to fill that out? And there's actually a big changes coming through in the FAFSA effective for this fall, where now it used to be the parent that filled out the FAFSA was whoever the student stayed with the most in the previous 12 months. Now it's going to be whoever provided the most support. Now, in
Hmm.
a lot of families, that's a distinction without a difference. It's the same person either way. But again, if we're in a situation where we're about to be divorced, or maybe we're not even separated yet, maybe we're still living in the same household and we're just starting the process, now there's a huge planning opportunity for families to say, well, which parent do we want to be on the form? And then based on that, how do we do placement and whatever so that that's in fact who will be on the form or should be on the form? Again, sometimes you want to have the lower income parent or that type of thing. So I've had situations where, because the income is drastically different once they're separated, we were able to get much more need-based aid by doing some good planning. Now, much more need-based aid doesn't make up usually for the financial hit that typically happens when you're separated, because now you've got two households and two places to live, and there's a lot more expenses, but at least college is a little more friendly, as an example.
Well, that's a
Um,
really fascinating scenario there. So, with this change in the FAFSA, so the parent who provides the most support in the 12-month period prior, is it 12-month period or is it the tax year prior?
I believe it's going to be tax year prior, but that's the kind of stuff that's still kind of up in the air as to what,
Okay,
when we get into the nitty gritty details, it's not real clear
And how would
sure.
you
yet.
determine that? Who provided the most support?
That's a good question. I can't
Look at
answer
you,
that.
Linda. Linda's
So,
Linda
right,
hitting with the real question.
right. So, I mean, here's the reality, right? So, family lives in Chicago. They get separated. Dad moves to Texas. It's pretty clear, and he's not paying child support, and they don't know where he is. It's pretty clear, it's mom all the way, right?
Right.
Where it gets a little gray is, again, we're still living, we're both in the same neighborhood, and the student sleeps wherever it's convenient. And a lot of times it doesn't matter what the agreements have said. The
By
student
that age.
actually says, well, mom's house is real close to school. I can walk to
Right.
school from her house. It's convenient as a 17-year-old for me to sleep there.
Right.
And it's like, and most parents are like, we don't see the kids anymore anyway. It doesn't
That's
really matter where
realistic.
they sleep. In the end, they're
Yes.
off doing their own thing at school,
Right.
and it's whatever works much more than whatever we agreed to when they were 10 and 7. Um,
Right.
that's the reality. And of course, how that factors into the financial aid. And that's where, again, another important point to all this is you need to start planning a little bit earlier. You mentioned, I think, that in a lot of cases, people start thinking about college, in their senior year. And the reality is they need to be thinking about it in their sophomore year.
Exactly.
Again, as an example, when you fill out your FAFSA, you use what's called prior year. So if we have a student that's starting college in 2024, that would be a rising junior right now, because rising senior right now, because they'd be graduating at roughly a year from now. They're going to be filling out the FAFSA this fall based on 2022 taxes. So if they're going to start college in 24, you're going to do the FAFSA in 23, and it's going to be based on 2022 taxes. So if we wanted to change those taxes, we would have had to do that planning a long time ago, because 2022 is already done. So right now we could impact 2023 and 2024 taxes. So now we could actually impact juniors and sophomores. And I think that's where a lot of people need to understand that if you start planning now, you maybe can. And the reason we care about your taxes is that your taxes are reported on the FAFSA, and that flows through and it determines how much aid you might receive.
Yep. And
Uh,
as the father of an 18-year-old who not too long ago completed FAFSA forms, you actually can have it pulled directly from the IRS, your tax information, to show you how intricately connected the two systems are.
right, exactly. And that's where, again, it gets a little more complicated, and especially the divorced and separated, there's rules and there's changing, so it's going to be even more complicated as far as how it all works. But again, there's a great planning opportunity around whose income and that type of thing. And with these recent changes, another important thing I think for your listeners to pay attention to is, with these recent changes, child support is going to be treated differently. Where it used to be considered income when it came into the whoever was filling out the FAFSA, it's going to be switched and it'll be considered an asset instead, which is actually beneficial. So there's some families out there that, because of child support, maybe they didn't qualify for as much aid. Well, the formulas are different now, so they may qualify. So there's a lot of families out there, just in general, I think, that might say, well, our freshman year, we didn't get anything, so we're not even going to try anymore. Well, I think that's a bad idea. I think you need to continue to try, because, again, the rules have changed. So you either need to understand the rules and do the math yourself to confirm that you're not going to get it, or just go ahead and apply and see, because, again, things have changed. So what happened last year is not necessarily going to be the same this year.
That's an
And
excellent suggestion. I don't think most people
right,
would have ever thought of that.
right, exactly. And because of these changes, one of the big changes is child support. So families that have received child support are going to see bigger changes year over year than other families, and business owners as well. And there's a couple other categories where, things might change pretty dramatically with the new system compared to the old.
That change in child support allocation to being an asset as opposed to income actually makes a lot of sense when you think about how the courts think of child support. Because, for example, in Oklahoma and in most other places I'm aware of, each month when that child support is due, it becomes an individual debt that's owing at that time that could be collected on. And
Right.
so that debt is something that is in the nature of an asset as opposed to income. So it sounds like the federal government's finally kind of getting on track with how the states have been treating child support obligations all along.
Right.
I didn't realize that all along. That's interesting.
Yep.
Right. And again, it's just something else that gets factored into the formula, and it can make a huge difference or no difference whatsoever. Another interesting change is, um, with the new FAFSA, there's what I would call an AGI test, where they download your they link up to your taxes and they look at your income, and if your income is below a certain amount based on the size of your family, then you may automatically qualify for the maximum Pell and get really good financial aid situation. And that target is somewhere between 60,000, well, even lower. So maybe 40,000 up to about 60 or 70,000. Well, again, in a divorce situation, a lot of times with only one income, it's a lot easier to be under those type of income numbers. And they don't count, child support doesn't count as income anymore. It counts as an asset. So that's not part of the process. So they look at your AGI, and if you're below these numbers, then the magic happens. So that's another reason why you may want to pick one parent over the other, because of that test. And if that test happens, then they don't even look at your assets. So a lot of times in the situation of a divorce, that's the other opportunity is, who owns the house compared to who owns the investments, and who owns the retirement, and who owns the college savings plans. All of those things have an impact on not just on family finances, but also on financial aid.
So I have a few questions, if I could, from what you said just a minute ago. So you said the word Pell. For the people who don't know what you're referring to, could you tell us what that is?
Right. So a Pell Grant is the main grant that the federal government issues. It's currently about $7,395 is the maximum currently, and that ticks up every year. So if I had to guess, maybe 7,800 coming up in this next school year.
Okay.
Maybe more or less. We wait to see what the budget says. But that is a free money. Does not have to be paid back. In the past, it was a little tougher to get that Pell. Now with these new rules, there's a lot of families out there that will, again, surprise, you get it now because you qualify under the rules, and divorced families are some of those families, I think, that will get that type of surprise.
Well, that's great
because
news.
the way the system works.
And you mentioned various types of investments or areas in which a person may own property. So 401ks, Roth IRAs versus an expensive car that they own outright, or land, or a house. Does the FAFSA process look at those different types of assets differently, or are they all treated the same?
Yeah, well, they fall into two, I guess, basic categories. One is it counts, and then every dollar that's there is added onto the pile, or it doesn't count. So as an example, things that don't count would be retirement assets. So your 401ks and IRAs are not considered an asset. You don't report them. Another category would be your home and your home equity of your primary residence. They don't count. And for a lot of families, that's a big chunk of your wealth. What does count? Well, a lot of the other things like business ownership now counts. That's a change. It used to be that small businesses didn't count. Now they will. Another big area would be college savings plans. So the various college programs that might be saved would be reported. Investments, money in the bank, that's not retirement related. So your mutual funds, your stocks, your bonds, your CDs, and then anything exotic, your Bitcoin, your oil wells, that kind of stuff would also probably be reported.
Linda's Bitcoin empire would come into play at that point.
Yes, exactly.
You forgot my oil well.
Now, right. And then the shift of in a divorced and separated situation, if only one parent is on the form, then that parent's assets count. So you could theoretically say, well, all the counted assets will give to the parent that's not on the form, and all the non-counted assets we'll put to the other parent. So when we're dividing it, we'll divide it a little differently than we would have otherwise. Now, of course, you always have to balance. This works great for college, but now I don't have any money to live on. Doesn't work, right? So you have to, factor in taxes, factor in how are we going to pay our bills and everything else as well. But again, if you as spouses that trust each other, you're probably better off to put the college savings in the other spouse's name so that they're not considered an asset
Do we
when it
know
comes
any
time to.
parents that trust each other that much?
Well, a lot of parents do, not
Really?
all,
That's
obviously.
amazing.
Yeah.
And I think there might be a little bit of a bias where a lot of times the parents that do trust each other and are more amicable don't go to the lawyers as much. So
Yes. We don't see the one either
right,
one
you
of
don't
us
see the
trusting
ones
them.
that are getting along because they don't need you.
Especially
Right.
Linda. Yeah. So there's a
Yeah.
self-selection bias for sure in what we're dealing with.
Right.
I'm just
The
happy to hear that there are people like that.
Oh, I've had a number of families that I've worked with over the years that literally say, we're part of the divorce process is college, and we want you to maximize college, and we'll do whatever so we factor it all in, right? We need to still be able to live, and both of us need to be able to afford our house and that kind of stuff. But in addition to that, we want to maximize college. We want to whatever we can do so that it has the least impact on the kids.
So, at what
What
point, in
concept?
terms of income, do they start caring about assets?
Again, if you're over that line, so a family of two, once you're over 45,000, then you start reporting the assets. A family of six, then the number I was working with, I think it was 72,000. Because it's based on poverty guidelines, and poverty guidelines are based on the number of people in the family. And so it's relatively complicated. But to work that out, I've got a calculator on my website that helps estimate what's called SAI, or Student Aid Index. Used to be called EFC, so a lot of people are familiar with the EFC calculator, or expected family contribution. But there's essentially a calculator on my website where you can calculate how much aid you might expect based on your situation, and then you can kind of play with it and say, okay, well, when do these assets come into play, and what if I have less assets or more income, and all that kind of stuff.
That's
Well,
real
that's
handy.
fantastic. And so, again,
Yeah.
that website is tamingthehighcostofcollege.com. And there's a
Correct.
resources tab where I believe is where you would go for that.
Yes.
So to give us a little bit of a sneak preview before they go and they use that resource, at what level of asset would it start to be the case that it would affect the amount of aid that you could get, or whether or not you could get a Pell Grant?
So right. So essentially, there's a kind of a two-pronged test. So the first test is your AGI below this target number? If the answer is yes, you're done. They're not going to look at your assets, even if it's $1 million.
Okay.
If the answer is no, then they're going to require you to fill out the assets. And then every asset you have that counts, again, 401ks aren't going to count, but if every countable asset, every dollar you have there will give you slightly less aid until it eventually just kind of slips away. It's just kind of like
Oh,
taxes, right?
wow.
Every dollar you earn, you a portion goes to taxes. Well, now it'll be every dollar you earn or every dollar you have, you get slightly less aid until the aid gets to be insignificant relative to the cost of college. So there
I
is no
was seeing
magic
that
number where
comparison.
people say,
Yeah.
if I cross this line, everything blows up. It generally doesn't work that way. It's like every
Okay.
$1,000 you earn, you get a little less aid, you get a little more, you pay a little more taxes, and every dollar you have in investments, same thing when it comes to financial aid. Is my Pell Grant might
Interesting.
have been set. I might have gotten the full Pell Grant, but because I have $1,000 more than I did, now my Pell Grant goes down by $20. If I had put another 1,000 on the pile, it goes down by another $20
Yeah. And
until
parents who pay or receive child support, that'll seem kind of familiar to them because usually the child support calculators work about the same. Every dollar that you make, you're paying a percentage towards this or that, and the numbers go up and down. I
right.
heard you say with the 529 plans that now they are counted assets. And so if a parent is wanting to, if you're going to pick one of two parents to be the person who does the FAFSA, then if they trusted each other, then it may be best that their income's going to be high enough so that they start to look at assets to have the 529 and the other parent, because they could still use the 529 to assist with the college payments, but it won't be counted for the FAFSA and reducing their loans or grants they could get. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, right? And
Wow.
that the key there is the trust, right? I've worked with a
Uh-huh.
family recently where mom, what I say is mom is holding the college bag. In other words, dad is kind of out of the picture, in that they're not real sure if dad is willing to help or not. And he's, again, they weren't getting along. So wasn't clear. Dad owned all the 529s, and she's like, well, how do I make him use that for college? And it's like, you can't. Dad owns the 529s. It's his money. He can do whatever he wants with it. He can spend it on college. He could take it out and take it to Vegas. He'd have to pay taxes and penalties, but he could do that. It's his money. You have no control over it unless there's some overriding agreement. Again, talk to your attorney about, maybe it was part of a settlement or something that theoretically ties his hands. But if it's just, a normal 529, whoever owns it decides what to do with it.
So that's real
And
So do
interesting.
those factor in the divorce? I don't think I've ever read a divorce decree that mentioned anything like that.
well, yes. And I think that's one of the things probably for a different podcast, but I think there is a kind of a bigger issue around the kids are adults, but a lot of stuff now bleeds into our child's adulthood that seems in the past didn't matter as much. But healthcare, you can be on somebody else's health coverage at age 26. Did we agree who was going to deal with that now or then, or should that's something we can go back and fight about later? That's that's the other challenge with divorce, I think, is we didn't talk about college. And I think, sometimes when attorneys give that advice, in my opinion, that might be bad advice, because essentially that's what you're saying is if we don't do anything about it now, then you're just going to have to fight about it later. And that might be the right answer, because it's hard enough to get a divorce done with the limited stuff that's going on sometimes, where you say, if we put college on there, it gets way too complicated. So we're just going to leave it out.
Your two examples, the healthcare and the 529 plan, I can see how they're connected. I can also see them being treated separately in a divorce decree. So, for example, since the 529 is property, it's going to be handled in the property and debt portions as opposed to the custody visitation and child support. And I could see negotiating for a provision that most parents, in my experience, at the time of the divorce, aren't really thinking about. They're not really that concerned about it, especially if the kids are younger. But to
Right.
say that the 529 funds in existence as of the time of the entry of the decree shall be used for their originally intended purpose, which is for the payment of college for children and then identify the children. I could see
Right.
that as opposed to having a provision about who in some uncertain future is going to be providing the health care when someone's finances may drastically change and it's not already a lump sum that already exists in somebody's account. So I can see them being treated differentially. But I
Right.
think that's great advice about the 529. And that's language that I think needs to start being entered into these decrees, to use for the stated purpose for these specific children. Because I imagine if a parent got remarried, had
Yes.
additional children, or adopted a child,
Yes.
and then start divvying up those funds for those other kids as well.
Yes, exactly. And again, it's their money unless otherwise stated somewhere. But yeah, so the healthcare, there's other examples, right? So if you pay for college for one of your dependents, then you're allowed to take a $2,500 tax deduction, assuming you spend $4,000.
Hmm.
Well, whose dependent is a 20-year-old college student? Is that
Oh,
clear when you look at the divorce decree? And and again, you can intentionally fill out some forms that say we agreed that this person is now going to be your dependent. It has nothing to do with how the rules work. We have the ability to just hand them back and forth based on filling out a form. But both parents can't claim the same student. So when someone says, well, I'm going to claim the oldest and you're going to claim the youngest, well, when we get to college, there's real consequences to that. What if the oldest is the only one that goes to college? Then whoever claims that person gets a bunch of tax deductions, and whoever claims the younger doesn't get any tax deductions because there's no college.
wow.
But
Wow.
like I
I,
said, because parenting used to end at 18, but it doesn't really anymore, I think there needs to be some update from, even if the divorce decree says some very basic things like we intend this divorce decree to not have any impact over age 18. And it's there and it's clear, because when I read them and I'm working with families, it's just really not clear in the paperwork. So then I guess it defaults to state statute or something, so maybe the attorneys understand. But what if neither one of us want to pay for health care for a 22-year-old? Can we both say we're not doing it?
so short,
Probably.
yeah, short answer, yes. So, like in Oklahoma, for example, the court loses jurisdiction over custody and visitation entirely at age 18, and the court loses jurisdiction over child support at the age of 20 if a child hasn't yet uh, graduated from high school. If they have graduated from high school, then whenever they graduated from high school and have also achieved the age of 18. So
Right.
that's when the courts say, in Oklahoma at least, we have nothing to do with them anymore. And also, I can imagine a judge saying, I'm happy to order whatever it is that you guys want to work together to order, but I can't put any limitations on this new adult. this 18-year-old who may decide they want to do something completely different. So anything that is in one of those degrees would have to be contingent upon the actual circumstances that develop over those subsequent years as the new adult child is making decisions themselves.
Right. Exactly.
But
And I
they would
think
want
there's a
health care probably, and they would want somebody to help them pay for college. So, those two things would seemingly go together. And it seems like
right.
whoever is providing the health care for that young adult would probably get the bennies in terms of the tax reduction.
Yes, unless you fill out the form that handed it off to the other parent. And sometimes that makes a lot of sense because the other parent needs the tax deductions because they pay a lot of taxes. Where one parent, and that's where the planning comes in. If we do it this way, we save
Oh,
taxes, but costs us financial aid. If we do it that way, it saves taxes and financial aid, and it works the best. But and the rules change, so that's the other challenge. Of course, is you can't agree to something now that it may not work 10 years from now. So it needs to have some flexibility potentially. So I think that's where, again, in a contentious situation, some attorneys tell people don't put anything in writing because then you got to do it. If we don't put it in writing, then you're not obligated to it. That's, I think, pretty simplistic advice because it's also then not clear. And then when you get there, you're not obligated to do anything. So then you have to fight about it or litigate it again or whatever to ultimately figure it out. Whereas maybe there's some standard language that might just be, this is what our intent is and put some outs in it if you need it. I don't want to be obligated to pay for college if I'm not still a surgeon making millions. If I'm disabled, I get out of this or whatever, right? But then it gets complicated. How much do you want to spend with the lawyers? So I see the problems. I don't necessarily know what the solutions are at this point.
Well, I was about to say we need a Brad Baldrige uniform provisions for for child tuition and healthcare to be
Yes.
distributed nationwide because
There you go.
it's already over my head.
right.
Thinking of all the possible permutations and you're right about the cost of litigation. If you try to do things that are really aspirational, but could get murky with changed
Right.
circumstances and potential change in legislation, then it's going to inevitably cause some litigation with people who are high conflict, where the fees regarding the litigation would probably overwhelm any benefit from even the best financial planning.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that, right. So I think goal number one is just get along and, and keep score if you need to and try and make it fair, whatever that means.
I love
But in
all
the
that.
end, right. I mean, but I think that's the challenge. And when I'm working with families, sometimes I am working with the parent that kind of gets stuck with college. In other words, we're in the middle of a divorce. I'm going to have to pick up the pieces and pay for college now because they're in the middle of college and that's just the way it is. Because if I don't do it, I don't think it'll happen. I think they'll have to drop out. So sometimes there's that kind of very unfortunate leverage going on, and that's not ideal. Um, but it's reality for some where it's like you're just going to have to figure it out whether they cooperate or not. Other times you can be cooperating, but when we get into the technicalities of it all, right? So as an example, we talked last time that financial aid looks at a tax return from prior year. So it looks back perhaps back when you were married and you have a joint tax return. So that's one challenge that I see a lot of families dealing with is you can now kind of pull the tax return apart and reconstitute it as if you were single,
Hmm.
and it changes how financial aid works when you fill out the forms then. So but that's a process that you need to really understand. There may, and I'm trying to think if we have any new rules with the new FAFSA. I'm not aware of them at this point, but they may be coming. I don't know. That's the other challenge is right now the FAFSA system is changing. So we don't have a lot of precedent where we had a lot of history with the old system. Now that they're changing the rules, we don't have a lot of history about, well, what do we do about this weird situation? But, that just doesn't exist at this point. So we're learning more. So I want to caveat that with, things could change next week if they release some new information I'm not aware of. But I think that's one of the challenges is things are changing midstream. For some families, that may mean you're going to qualify for more aid, which might then mean, but then you got to figure out how to apply for it and do it well. Sometimes you're also dealing with how the colleges will view it, where, again, with smaller families or other situations. So I think there's some opportunities there that, again, and there's a lot of provisions based on the appeal process, right? So when you're working with colleges, you fill out the application process and then you can appeal the award, and perhaps they'll reconsider it. And usually you're appealing it because something happened. Like Hurricane Katrina, when it wiped out lots of people's livelihoods and businesses, there was kind of a blanket permission that anybody affected by Hurricane Katrina had an appeal and probably could easily get that through, because it was just so devastating to a lot of those families, and Hurricane Sandy and other natural
Or
disasters
COVID.
like that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be caused by a natural disaster. There could be a death in the family, there could be a separation, there could be a divorce. That would be an example of a reason to have an appeal. So you can go back to the college and say, well, we're a little confused. And a lot of, colleges are set up to help with those types of things. In the end, they may or may not be able to help, but it's always worth a shot as well.
Yeah,
And
I
then,
guess the colleges want students to have access to as much money as possible. So is
yes.
that why they're set up to help?
Well, yes. I mean, it's right. Again, the way the financial aid system works is the federal government puts these programs together and then they push it onto the colleges to administer it and
Mhm.
figure out all the rules and do all the paperwork and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of in the college's purview then to determine, in these situations, we can override what's on the form because it's no longer relevant. Yes, 2 years ago, your income was much better than it is now. So we're going to use a more current data, and based on current data, then maybe you get more aid. And again, the aid could come from the federal government, could come from state, or it could come from the college themselves. Another important thing is a lot of colleges don't want their students left hanging, especially if it was out of the student's control, right? They may have a little bit of mercy and say, well, if we can just come up with a couple thousand more, then we can get the student graduated. Sometimes that's in the college's best interest. Just from a purely selfish, we want more graduates to actually graduate from our institution because we want to keep our statistics strong. So if we have to throw some money at this student to make it happen, we will.
That's really
Um,
interesting.
Yeah, I
Never
didn't
thought
know that
about it
ever
that way.
happened. That's pretty
right.
cool.
But
And it's interesting too, also to hear the word appeal. And as an attorney, and if you're involved in the legal system, typically you're thinking of an appeal as the facts are set. You can't go back and change the facts. You can now make some arguments about the facts that previously existed. But I hear you saying that in the FAFSA world, a change in circumstance is something that can be the basis of an appeal. And so if your child's already in college and maybe you applied and you didn't get it before because you had a joint tax return, that change in circumstance of the divorce means, hey, go back and maybe look at an appeal because maybe that change in circumstance can help you out.
right, absolutely. And like I said, the right answer sometimes is you can't rely on the automatic system that pulls in the tax return that isn't applicable anymore. You need to manually do it. And most families aren't equipped to do that and probably don't even know that they should have done that. So, again, in a divorce situation, I think that you start at the college and ask for their help, or find, an expert like myself or wherever, but get some help. It's not something that most people are going to be able to do on their own. Well, and again, many people are capable of doing it, but you have to spend the time to understand the whole system, and it gets pretty complicated. So either you spend a lot of time understanding and planning, or you outsource it to the college or to an advisor or something.
Well, I can tell you, I just recently went through the FAFSA form. Like, I think we did it 2 months ago for my kid. And from our perspective, it was stressful, not because we thought we were going to get any aid, because we know we're not. But in Tulsa County, there's a program called Tulsa Achieves where a child can go for 2 free years of education at a local community college and completely paid for. But you have to fill out FAFSA in order to get the Tulsa Achieves money.
I didn't realize
Right.
So,
that.
yep. So even, and the reason I bring that up is that even a fairly sophisticated person like myself, don't laugh, Linda,
Yeah,
trying to fill out the
definitely
FAFSA,
are.
even when I knew I didn't have a lot of money on the line, it was just for this local Tulsa Chiefs. It was still complicated. It was stressful.
Yes.
It was annoying. It was kind of like that person where you see their number come up on your phone. You're like, oh, I'm not picking that up. That's how I felt about filling out the FAFSA. Like when I sat down to the computer, I had this sense of dread. Like I cannot believe I have to go do this again.
Right.
So
Exactly. And if the divorce is happening while there's kids in college, I mean, it's just a busy time. And I think a lot of times the keeping up with the paperwork and dealing with the college stuff falls by the wayside just from a matter of we don't have the emotional energy to do all that needs to get done. And so we just let stuff drop. And I've seen that, and divorce isn't the only reason that that happens. I've had situations, where there's a death in the family and all of a
Someone's
sudden
really ill.
somebody's really ill. Exactly. All of a sudden, that stuff didn't seem important and it probably wasn't important, but now you're falling behind. And when it does become important, now all of a sudden you got to get caught up and,
so
And,
and it could cost you,
and
unfortunately.
in my little neck of the woods here, it gets in the way of the relationship, and sometimes really does a lot of damage to the relationship between the young adult child and the parent that they thought was going to, or that had started out paying the majority of the college tuition and so forth. And um, something happens like you're just describing, and that parent is no longer picking up that ball, and it can really cause a rift in the relationship.
yeah,
Yeah.
or you get to the areas of distrust, and I've seen multiple occasions where, as a parenting coordinator, I've had parents come to me, and one parent will say, "That other parent won't give me their tax return that I need to help complete the FAFSA." And the parent who isn't giving it is saying, "Well, they don't really need it. They just wanted to figure out how much money they can come after me for." So all of those entanglements occur in the midst of the litigation process.
Right.
So, Brad, let's say that you have a kid who hasn't graduated high school yet. Let's which next age group should we consider?
Right. So so let's talk about the late stage college planning situation. And that would be high school sophomore through senior when all the heavy lifting happens as far as visits and test planning and applications and all that stuff. So another great example of we were distracted by, setting up two households when we had a high school sophomore. College seemed a long ways away, so we didn't even think about it till senior year. And now all of a sudden, oh my God, I guess we should have not done that because we're way behind now. That's I think a reality for a lot of families that are,
For
if kids are in
sure.
high school.
Yeah.
Um, and so ideally, if you can avoid that, that would be great. But um, again, now we're starting to talk about, well, we can plan, with kids already in college, maybe the impact only happens on a year or two of college. Whereas if you got a bunch of kids in high school and younger, you know, it's going to be real quick. So you're already visiting colleges or thinking about it or whatever it is, and then you're saying, well, who's going to pay for all this? And that's when the reality starts sinking in of, well, when we were together, we said things like any college, any price, we can make it happen. But now we have to renege on that maybe. And again, not a lot of parents have ever said any college, any price. This is not in the last 5 or 10 years
I know.
because
I
it's
was trying
been
to.
crazy expensive now. But when I
Yeah.
first started
That's if
this,
the grandparents are paying, right?
right,
Yeah.
exactly. When I first started this, college was a little more reasonable. And a few
Oh
parents
yeah.
would say, we don't care what it costs. We'll just pay for it. If that school's the best fit, we'll pay for it. We'll figure it out.
Yeah. That
Um,
explosion has been crazy in prices. I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day. My law school was $7,000 a semester.
right.
Nothing. I can't
Exactly.
even imagine.
Yeah. I happened to my mom and found my old ACT paperwork when I took the college testing back in 1984, I think it was.
Wow.
And the school, I sent that score to the school ultimately that I attended, and that showed up in that paperwork. Their tuition was $1,200,
For a
which
semester?
for the year.
Oh,
Yeah. So
Wow.
I mean, it's just, again, so but way back then it was a little state school, so it was, but the private schools that I didn't attend, but I sent the paperwork to, were 5,600 and 5,400, I think,
Wow.
tuition for the year. So yes, the numbers have greatly exploded,
Wow.
um, for sure. And we can, that's a whole other discussion as well. As well, they raise the prices, we still come, so why not raise the prices?
Sure. It's a captive
Um,
market.
exactly. But anyway, so yeah, but so the looking back on the, I guess, the high school kids, I think there's also a lot of who's going to do what as you're rearranging how parenting is going to go. Does everybody go on the visits? Does somebody take charge of figuring out the finances and somebody else take charge of the visits? Which often worked, divide and conquer was often a family strategy when families
right.
are intact. But now, why are you visiting those schools? We can't afford them. Kind of challenges might come into play. But in reality, maybe you can afford them, because that's the other thing, is when you get into college planning, in a lot of cases, you don't know what the college is going to cost until after you've really worked the numbers and understand the process. Because of, as an example, Stanford released a press release that said any family whose income is under $100,000, tuition, room and board, everything is zero, free. You do not pay. If your family income's under 150,000, then tuition is free and you just pay for room and board. Well, based on that, and well, when they say family income, what do they mean when in a divorce situation, right? And you're in the middle of a divorce and you're saying, well, so it's time to get some clarification, which is another complication. But in a lot of situations, if your student get into Stanford, that's another challenge, because their acceptance rate is in the 3% range now. So, they take a lot of very talented kids, and is what's required to get in, and many more apply than they can accept. So even academic rock stars are being denied at Stanford. Um, so that's the next challenge. But again, it can work out where you've got a lot of work to do, and the divorce is just making it that much more complicated. And if you're in the divorce process while college is happening as well, I see it just getting overwhelming for most families. And a lot of times that's why they call me, is we're just overwhelmed by all this, and we can't let college fall by the wayside. Tell us
Yeah,
what we need to do and
that
push it
makes a
through.
lot of sense. A lot of sense. And it's so as you're talking, you know, as we see families break apart and reconstitute themselves in new ways, you're creating a new identity for yourself, a new identity for yourself as a family system. And why not, in the midst of that recalibration or reconstitution process, do so in such a way that it actually makes college more achievable financially for your kids? Seems like I never think of this divorce or separation as, not never, but I mostly don't think of it as a potentially beneficial situation. Usually we just focus on the negative of it. But I'm hearing from you that there could be some real positives in terms of making college education more affordable for the kids if the parents understand some of the opportunities that are out there and get the advice that someone like you can offer them.
Yes, absolutely. But again, just to be clear, what it really is making lemonade out of lemons,
Right.
right? So yes, college may be more affordable, but the fact that college is more affordable is not going to make up for the fact of everything else got a lot less affordable,
Right.
Oh,
potentially,
for
right?
sure.
I mean, so the cost of the divorce is going to be much greater than the college benefit. And the reason I say that is because I have a lot of parents say things like, well, this is so unfair, we should just get divorced, then we could pay for college. And in jest, they're right. In reality, once you've been through a divorce, you know that that's not anywhere near accurate. But it
Correct.
seems that way to some people, and say, well, if I'm divorced, then we get all these benefits,
Well, I
which is true.
definitely wouldn't institute a divorce for
Right.
college. But if you're already getting divorced, it seems like a great opportunity, like you said, to squeeze some of that lemonade out.
Exactly. And that was my point, right? Is yes,
Yeah.
if the divorce is happening and you need to do it for other reasons, well then do it in a college efficient manner if you can. But it's
So
That's
do
not
you wind
amazing.
up being somewhat of a mediator between the divorced parents? They sit down with you together to plan this?
yes. Right.
Okay.
So I give the parent, again, when the people I'm working with people, sometimes I'm working with just the parent that kind of again gets stuck with the college process because
Okay.
that's the way it is, right? They're in charge, they have to make it happen. They care enough to work it out and make it help, and figure it out. Whether that's because they're the one that's willing to do the work, and maybe the other parent is happy to pay, but they just aren't going to be doing the visits and the planning and the forms and the, you know, whatever. Or it could be they have to do everything. They have to pay for it all, that type of stuff. So I guess that's kind of that question. I mean, it's much easier when we get to the very young kids, right? It's much easier to say, well, that's a problem for another day. It doesn't work when you have a high school sophomore. That's a problem for 6 months from now or a year from now. The divorce won't even be final, and it's and the ramifications of the divorce will start becoming into full play.
Well, I
Um,
can see a provision of an order saying that the parents are required to contract with a college financial specialist and work with that person in good faith to achieve the best uh, combination of college savings possible, blah blah blah, some language that basically just gets the professional in place and then doesn't try to predict what all of the nuance of the outcome is going to be because it's impossible to do so, but just get them there and have them work in good faith to follow the advice. Because we do that with selling a house all the time. We'll order a house to be sold. You agree on a realtor, you follow their advice to set the house at the best commercially reasonable price, you follow the recommendations in terms of making repairs. So that same sort of model in terms of language could be used for financial planning for college as well, I would think.
Is this also something that a special master could be appointed for dealing with down the road?
You- Yeah, but I think there's so few of them that
Uh,
I can't, it'd be hard to imagine a judge to do that.
right.
But that other idea, what would you do if you got an order like that? If parents came to you and said, "Hey, we have this order, we have to work with a college financial planning specialist." How would you feel about getting an order like that?
I mean, I do it already, but I'm much more of these are the facts. If you do this, this will here's the benefits and here's the drawbacks, and if you do that, here's the benefits and here's the drawbacks, and if you do this. But in the end, I don't know which benefits and drawbacks are most important for your situation. Some people
Mhm.
are like, if it's going to save me money, I'll do it. Other people are like, no, it's important my kid go to that school instead of that school. I'm willing to spend more money. So if one parent is saying, I'm willing to spend more money to get the school we want, and the other parent is saying, I don't want to spend more money, I don't know. I try and stay out of that part of it.
it's out of your hands,
I
right?
can do the math and say this one will be more expensive than that one. And the need-based aid projections and that kind of stuff. And then maybe I can say, well, if we're going to go to that school, we should do this on the need-based aid side of things. We could change how we separate assets, and that would make it better.
Mhm.
But
It sounds like the order's
again,
just getting
all of
them
this stuff,
there.
yeah.
Yeah, so in that order may have to explicitly prioritize the goals.
Correct.
What so that would then help someone like Brad do it.
Right, exactly. And I think that's the challenge of, I mean, again, I'm not saying I don't understand exactly where my authority stops and starts and that kind of stuff. So in general, what I tell people is I will work for you if you're the one that hires me. In other words, I will give you some coaching on, no, be aware that if you let them have the 529s, it's their money and they can do what they want with it. So if you're afraid that you can't trust them, then you probably don't want to allow that to happen, as an example. And I would
Yeah.
say that at any point, right? But I would make a special point of it if, like, I'm working for a particular parent. If I'm working for both parents, now it's a little tighter challenged as far as, well, these are options and they all have pluses and minuses, and because it really boils down a lot of times too, like one parent earns 120,000, the other parent earns 60,000. Who should pay more for college? Should it be equal, or should it be based on income? Or I don't know. There's no right answer there.
Yeah. Well, I can see your services being really useful too in a collaborative divorce process
Yes, I
Yes.
was
where they
thinking
bring
that.
in. Had
And
you
I
ever
would,
participate in those?
yes, I've been
Oh,
part of the collaborative council here in the Milwaukee area in the past. So I've,
There you
right,
great.
go.
there's this kind of, in my mind, to oversimplify it, there's kind of the three levels. There's the collaborative divorce where everybody at the table has agreed that this is going to work out collaboratively, or we're going to walk away and you have to start over with somebody else. Then
Mhm.
there's the mediation where there's just one person kind of in the middle, kind of corralling things and making sure you understand the rules and stuff. So there's not as many people involved. And then, of course, there's just the general divorce where we're going to work it out. We each have our own attorney. We could end up in court, or maybe we'll settle out of court, but the old style.
Yeah.
Um, and I think there's a place in all of those areas for better understanding of how college is impacted by whatever it is you decide to do.
Yeah, for sure. Completely get that. Well, I digressed you off track. So we talked about college kids. We talked about sophomore, late stage planning for the high school student. What's the next level earlier than that?
Right. Well, then it's just the younger kids where college is not an immediate concern. And I think now there's a, I think there still needs to be some sort of agreement on how are we dealing with college. Because I think most parents don't realize when we just completely ignore it, what our agreement kind of inadvertently says is we'll fight about that later. Don't want to talk about it now. We'll fight about that later. And if you agree that that's what you want, great. But I don't think most attorneys explain it that way.
I
Is
don't
if
think
we
most
don't,
attorneys explain college planning at all.
At
all right.
all.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because, and that's the reality, right? And when it does come up, most attorneys' advice is don't put anything in writing because then you'll have to do it. And if we, and right. And that's where I think some, as we talked about in the last episode, of having something that's a little clearer, even if it's not part of the agreement, but at least, because I think there's also some state by state issues of, well, this is how it works in this state, but it works differently in that state. And I can't keep it all straight. And
Oh,
I think no parents can keep it straight. I think attorneys that work in multiple states probably can't keep it straight.
yeah.
Um, but I think there's a lot of challenges there of, well, can we compel parents to pay if we want to? Does it have to be in writing, or could we just do it without writing? I mean, there's been some situations where students have sued parents and forced them to pay for college, where that never would have worked had the parents been together, but because they were separated, somehow the divorce felt like the student was getting the short end of the stick, and they stuck it to both parents somehow, I think. But anyway, you would know more about that than I perhaps. But that's the reality: is college is, again, the kids are adults. Theoretically, maybe it's nobody's responsibility but the kids. But when you look at financial aid, they certainly consider the parents important piece of the puzzle. When you fill out the financial aid, they're going to look at the parents' income. So if
Right.
there's that real challenge of, well, your parents earn hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, so you as a student don't qualify for anything. Yeah, but my parents said they're not paying.
Right.
Well, then go back to them and tell them they have to, because we're not paying either.
Right.
And that's where that weird leverage comes into play of. And then another important thing to realize, I guess, in all across all of this as well, is for the FAFSA, there's certain rules, but there's a lot of colleges that do what's called the CSS profile, which is an additional financial aid form. And a lot of times that form is filled out by both parents and all new spouses. So they will
Wow.
look
Oh,
at the income and assets in a blended family of everybody.
I wondered how
Wow.
that happened. Okay.
And that may, and again, they may or may not take it into account in different ways. And when it comes to that side of it, we're talking about schools like the Stanfords and the high end schools that are giving out full rides because of your financial situation. They want to know more information. They may not give a full ride to a family where dad's a professional baseball player and makes millions, but they happen to be divorced and mom doesn't, they might look at dad and say, well, dad could pay if you wanted to.
That
And
makes it
therefore
even
they're
more that makes it even more interesting to me that under a certain income threshold, they don't even look at your assets because you could have somebody who has, I mean,
well,
Right.
I
again, that's the
guess,
FAFSA,
right in the
not the
FAFSA,
CSS profile, just the
right,
FAFSA. So all colleges work with the FAFSA. That would be
right.
all 2,000 plus colleges. There's about 300 colleges that, in addition to the FAFSA, also get the CSS profile.
Oh,
It's just
Now,
fascinating, even just on the FAFSA side, because you could have someone who's literally a billionaire who only has $50,000 in income, and they
yes,
would get maximum aid.
correct.
That's fascinating.
Right. Well, and again, that's the system. And with the new changes, you can actually, it's based on your income and your AGI. And in some cases, you can manipulate your AGI by putting more money in retirement, as an example. Right. If
Mhm.
I earn 70,000 and I want to get it to below 60,000, if I put more money in my 401ks or IRAs, that may help me get across the line. It doesn't always work depending if you're a business owner or not. So another important thing to realize, right, is college planning. There's kind of the big overarching strategy, and then there's the little tactics and minutia of if I do this, then that, and that'll save me $50, or that'll save me $5,000, or that'll help me get a Pell Grant, or and sometimes it's very, again, in divorce, there's this interesting little tidbit around child support's not income and now it's an asset. So that changes the rules and you can potentially use that to your advantage. Again, hypothetically saying, well, I'll give you more assets and more child support. Or I'll give you more assets if you give me more child support. And again, if you can, in some states, if both parties agree, they'll rubber stamp it pretty easily. Other places you can't adjust the formulas and they're not going to let you play those games.
Yeah, it's
Um,
interesting.
but you could do that and get a lot more aid potentially. Um, so yeah, so I think, but I guess circling back around to the very young kids, that's what we're talking about, right? Is if you were together, you were saving 300 a month per child for college. Now that you're separated, are we going to continue that? Is college still a goal? Can we afford to do that? Should we do that? If we're going to do it, who's responsible? Again, is it contractual in writing, or is it we'll do the best we can? We agree. Um, and then maybe if it's not, if it's again, and I would defer to your attorney of, well, if it's a verbal contract, is that with, if we put it in writing, should we put it in writing saying that it's intentionally not binding? Because if we don't put it in writing that it's not binding, we might be able to argue that they said they were going to do it, so now it is binding.
Yeah,
I don't know.
there's lots of different legal
whew,
theories, lots of different things around that, like statute of frauds when you have to put something in writing if it's a contract, and just
Right.
all sorts of different
wow.
contract theories that would be implicated there that are a big no thank you.
Exactly. All that stuff, talk to your attorney because every state's a little different. And, but I think that's the challenge of, again, when you have very young kids, it's going to come up much later. And there's a good chance life as we know it is substantially different. Maybe there's remarriages or blended families, or maybe that student
Most of
grew
the
up to be
time.
the academic rock star and wants to go to Stanford, but because they're going to look at both parents, they're not going to give you any aid at all. And Stanford's 85,000 a year. One parent thinks that's a great idea, and the other parent says that's not such a good idea and doesn't want to pay their share, whatever that means.
Right. And
So
that's a
how much
great
of that do you want to deal with when you've got a 4-year-old?
and
Do we
that's a
need
great
to?
segue to talk about, if we can, the rock star and the student athlete. You had mentioned that there might be a couple specific things about those folks.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So right, the additional complication, so divorce is one of those things that makes college planning more complicated. But there's many others. Like if your family is involved, has business owners or rental property owners, you can do things like hire the kids in the business and get some tax advantages. You can set up tuition reimbursement plans. Mom works for herself as a realtor. She sets a tuition reimbursement plan for her employees. Well, surprise, surprise, who goes to work for her? One of the kids. And she says, well, just like these other places, if you get an F or better, I'm going to reimburse you for your college. Can you do that? You can. Is it a good idea? Maybe, right? And then you factor that in and say, well, if I'm hiring the kids in my business and we're divorced, I'm, technically I'm doing it for tax purposes, and it's their money, but I want you to give them an equal amount of money outside the system to be fair. It's like, well, wait a minute, it's not fair because of whatever your business is taking advantage of it or what. So it can
Right.
get more
You're
complicated.
paying maybe a third of what I am because you're writing it off as a tax deduction, and it's all
Right.
post-tax income for me.
Exactly. And then, right. And you could argue back and forth all day long about, well, then start a business and pay them my way. I don't care.
And then
But
when that parent tells the child, now an adult almost, that that parent is holding the college bag and was supposed to be, using it for their college, and that child confronts the parent, in my office saying, I want the bag. I don't trust you to continue to hold the bag in this
yep.
divorce. And I mean, I had one real recently say that, essentially those words, I want the bag. I don't trust either one of you. I want to go to college and I want what I've been earning and what you've been promising me.
Yes, absolutely. And another very common thing that I've heard is we were divorced 15 years ago and now we're at college and one parent says, I make no money, he makes a ton of money, or the other way around, whatever. They should pay for college, they make all the money. And then the high earner says, I've been paying crazy amounts of child support for years and years and years.
Oh
Where did
yeah.
all that money go?
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah. And we can
And
refer our listeners back to our podcast episode, What is Child Support For?
Right.
yes, but again, expectations of child support is child support. It is not being saved for college. That needs to be separate if that's in fact the reality. And here it is in writing. We talked about it back then because, again, I'm sure you guys deal with this when people are looking back on something that happened 5 and 10 years ago. The two versions of reality are drastically different in the same meeting.
Oh, yeah.
And
Or,
what they've told the children about that agreement in the first place.
right.
Exactly. So, right. So I think that's when you start talking about, people that have very young kids. Well, and again, anything where you're not really in the college process and you're thinking, well, we're not visiting. We didn't, we've got a 10-year-old. They're probably going to college, but we don't know where. We don't know what it's going to cost. Right now they're still talking about cowboy and firefighter.
Mm-hmm.
When will they get real? I don't know, and we'll deal with it then. I mean, I think there's just, again, that opportunity to get yourself in a little bit of a bind and trouble.
Although those actually are real options in Oklahoma.
Yes.
They could be a cowboy or a firefighter. Although I'm not sure college is required.
There you go.
Well, that's really fascinating. Is there anything else, Brad, that you think we need to know that we just weren't smart enough to ask you?
Well, again, college planning is not a 1 or a 2 hour podcast. It's lots and lots of hours of parents and students working together and really laying it out. And, there's things that parents can do early when the student isn't ready, like saving and investing and planning and some of that kind of stuff. And then there's a whole new round when you get to the late stage of now the student's involved and we really got to get into the meat of that as well, where you may have saved a ton of money and everything's all great as far as having the finances figured out. But we still have to do the visits and the testing and the applications and all that stuff. So that, the early versus late stage. But again, I think for a lot of families, it's a little more complicated than it used to be. And it's going to take more time than it used to. And it's a process, right? You start wherever you start, and then start learning and visiting and understanding. And then, the student says, I don't like these kind of schools. And then you start over with the kind of schools they think they like. And then you realize, well, they don't have the academics to get into those schools. So then you have to go readjust for that. And, they change their mind of what they want to be when they grow up, and things like divorce and things come along and rock the boat, where you do the best you can, but it's going to take some time and effort. And it's, like I said, it's a process. You don't work it out one time. You do some things, and then you go learn stuff, and you go back and apply what you've learned and kind of take the next step. And, sometimes there's lots of really clear paths. And sometimes, I have 3 kids. My 2 oldest, very much knew what they wanted to be when they grew up. That part was easy. I've got a 16-year-old, soon to be 17. She has a tough time with a career path. And career path is kind of the first step in what kind of majors might be appropriate. If you want to be in genetics counseling, you go down this path. If you want to be in business, you might go down that path. And it's a bit of a challenge. And that's something is new to me, even though this is my 3rd kid. So all the challenges are different, and it's just a process.
Well, we can't thank you enough for being willing to spend your time with us today. Linda, I'm not going to speak for you, but I was fascinated by this information. I was completely
too.
ignorant about all of the different nuances of it. And so I found it extremely informational. And I'm just really grateful, Brad, for you spending the time with us.
Yeah. So thanks for having me.
Me too. Thank you.
And so if you want to learn more about Brad, he's got tamingthehighcostofcollege.com. It's a wonderful website. He's got tons of information and resources there. I've sort of played around on it a little bit, and there's just so much there. That would be your first stop to find out more about how to get ready to begin your financial planning for college.
Yep,
If you
absolutely.
want to contact Brad, he's got his contact information there as well. And he also has a podcast, Taming the High Cost of College. So check that out. All of the links are going to be in the show notes. So please do follow them and learn more about Brad and all the different ways that he can help you through his site, through his podcast, or individually if you want to get in touch with him. So thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Disclosures. The information provided to you today is for educational purposes only. It is not intended to be specific recommendations or advice. Please consult with a qualified professional before acting on any of this material. Investing involves risk. Depending on the types of investments, there may be varying degrees of risk. Investors should be prepared to bear loss, including total loss of principal. 529 College Savings Plan Disclosures. Investors should carefully consider investment objectives, risk, charges, and expenses. This information and other important information are contained in the fund prospectuses, summary prospectuses, and the 529 product program description. These documents can be obtained from a financial professional or directly from the plan's website. Please read them carefully before investing. Depending on your state of residence, there may be an in-state plan that offers tax and other benefits, which may include financial aid, scholarship funds, and protection from creditors. Before investing in any state's 529 plan, investors should consult a tax professional. If withdrawals from 529 plans are used for purposes other than qualified education, the withdrawal could be subject to a 10% federal tax penalty, state penalties, federal income tax, and state income tax. Brad Baldrige's disclosures. Brad Baldrige is a registered representative with Cambridge Investment Research. Securities are offered through Cambridge Investment Research, Incorporated, a broker-dealer, and member of FINRA and SIPC. Brad Baldrige is also an investment advisor representative with Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, a registered investment advisor. Baldrige Wealth Management and Baldrige College Solutions are affiliated. Cambridge and the Baldrige companies are not affiliated. The registered branch location is at 10521 West Layton Avenue, Suite 200, Greenfield, Wisconsin, 53228.